Welcome to the Illinois State Historical Society's 2021 History Symposium plenary session entitled Reevaluating Historical Monuments in Illinois. This ties in, of course, with the theme of the symposium, which is changing landscapes. My name is Dave Joens, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this panel discussion. Before we begin, I want to commend the Illinois State Historical Society for putting on this symposium, and especially for putting on this panel discussion. If you aren't a member of the society, please join. We need you. We need your voice, we need your opinion, and we need your support. William Faulkner once wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Over the last couple of years, and especially in the year 2020, we've seen how relevant the past can be, as the nation has wrestled very publicly with its history. In 2020, a movement, and I hate to say began, but really crystallized, that questioned the use of public space in memorializing and interpreting the past. It began in the South with calls to tear down statues of Confederate leaders. In some cases, units of governments removed statues, renamed parks, streets, and other tributes, reviewed dated language on plaques and memorials, and opened up conversations about appropriate commemorations utilizing public space. In some cases, the statues still remain. And in some cases, dissatisfied protesters began to take these issues into their own hands and tore down or vandalized these statues. Over the summer, the movement spread north, and people questioned memorials to individuals and organizations whose pasts were a little more nuanced. As a historian, I know I welcome these discussions, but the fact is these discussions can be emotional, and sometimes nuance is lost. Last July in Chicago, 2 statues of Christopher Columbus were removed following protests, and Mayor Lori Lightfoot was quoted as saying that this was done. It was removed by the city. The statues were removed by the city of Chicago. And Mayor Lori Lightfoot was quoted as saying this was done in response to demonstrations that became unsafe for both protesters and police, as well as efforts by individuals to independently pull down the Grand Park statue, pulled down in an extremely dangerous manner. The city has created a committee known as the Chicago Monuments Project to review the city's collection of monuments, with an eye towards creating a platform for the public to engage in a civic dialogue about Chicago's history. Chicago is not the only community in Illinois where this dialogue has begun. And today we are joined by 3 panelists who will discuss this issue from their community's perspective. I'd like to start by introducing all 3 panelists. First, we have Andrea Aggert. Andrea Aggert was selected as the 3rd architect of the capital of Illinois in 2019 after working several years as a project architect for Shive Hattery.
Yes.
Thank you. An Iowa-based architecture and engineering firm with an office in Bloomington. The Office of the Architect of the Capitol is responsible for developing and implementing a long-range master plan of development for the Capitol complex. And I know you're more than knee-deep in that right now, Andrea. A native of Newton, Illinois, she received an undergraduate degree in architecture from Southern Illinois University and a master's degree in architecture from the University of Illinois. Also joining us is Sherry Williams. Ms. Williams was raised in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago and moved to Bronzeville, the Bronzeville neighborhood as an adult. A community activist and environmentalist, she is the founder and president of the Bronzeville Historical Society on Chicago's South Side. Ms. Williams has an undergraduate degree in African American and Black Studies from Northeastern Illinois University and a master's degree in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois. Finally, we'll be joined by Walter Williams. Mr. Williams lives in Edwardsville, Illinois, and serves as that city's Economic and Community Development Director. He held similar positions in Commerce City, Colorado, and Farmington, Missouri. Mr. Williams has been involved in the Edwardsville chapter of the NAACP for the past several years, and last November was elected as that organization's new president. Mr. Williams holds a bachelor's degree in economics and African American studies from Denison University and a Master of Business Administration from the John Carroll University. In all honesty, I'm thrilled that this is a panel not made up of historians. Each panelist is bringing a different perspective to the discussion and a different expertise as it relates to what has happened in their communities. And it truly shows, in my opinion, that again, history is not just about the past, it's very relevant today. Each panelist will speak for about 5-10 minutes, longer if they wish, on these issues as reflected in their communities. I'll then ask them some questions and we should have a good discussion. And that will conclude the recorded part of this session. We're recording on April 12th, by the way. But most of us will return to take live questions from you, the audience, following the airing of this session. So with that, I'd like to begin, and I'd start with Andrea Aggert, the architect of the Capitol. Andrea?
Hi. Well, Dave, thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this today. I'm elated to speak on anything when it comes to the Capitol complex. We have a lot of cool things happening here in the next few years. So I'll tell you a little bit about my involvement in some of the background that Dave had given us. In July of 2020, Speaker Michael Madigan had issued a statement requesting that the Office of the Architect, or the agency that I'm responsible for, we facilitate the removal of 2 statues on the complex. This is Stephen Douglas and Menard, and these 2 statues had been on the complex, I think, for close to 100 years. I don't remember those specific details, but that statement, and coupled with the covering of the Stephen Douglas portrait that was located in the House chamber. So obviously the piece of artwork that is in the House chamber needs to be voted on by all the members. And with Madigan no longer the Speaker of the House, I think that will probably take place in the next couple of weeks. But if you would walk into the House chamber today, you would not have any idea that there is a very large portrait that is covered. It in fact looks like a huge speaker. So that is a separate issue inside the building. But let me talk a little bit about Stephen Douglas, or Douglas and Menard. I'll just call them that. So my office was given the directive to remove them, and we facilitated that process over probably 6 to 8 weeks. As you can imagine, removal of 100-year-old statues are never easy. And I'm going to talk about the construction aspect of it. Obviously, there's no one around that was present when they were placed. So we were unsure of how they were anchored, connected to the base. So it took some investigation. And specifically, we found that there were companies, local companies, because of the political nature of this, that did not want to be involved with the removal process. So because they could lose business, either, whatever side, if they helped out or if they didn't. So they just chose to stay out of the entire process. We did plan for the removal to happen on a Saturday. We chose a Saturday because it is what we would presumably call the least busiest. And we really didn't want to disrupt anybody, and nor did we want to give these 2 a fanfare of sorts when their removal happened. So I can say that they were removed in a process of a couple of days, boxed up, and they are now in storage for probably an indefinite amount of time, or until we receive direction to do something else with them.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Boy, a couple of things there that I certainly didn't know about, quite honestly, including perhaps the difficulty of getting a company to remove or not remove the statues. Next, we're going to talk to Walter Williams about, I guess, somewhat of a similar situation about statues, in this case, just one statue in Edwardsville, Illinois. And of course, with a kind of ironic twist, because it was a statue to Ninian Edwards, who the town is named after. So Walter?
Thank you. Walter Williams, City of Edwardsville, Community Economic Development Director. Thank you for the introduction, as well as NAACP President. Edwardsville, as you know, is a community of approximately 27,000 people. The city's racial makeup is 87.7% white, 8.66% African American. Currently, there are no persons of color serving on city council. This past summer, we, like other communities, started looking at ourselves a little bit more critically. And looking at things that kept racism alive. Up until this point, there was no second thought given to the statue that was erected in 2008 of the man who we consider the namesake of the city. In Illinois' history, Ninian Edwards was the first governor, first territorial governor, and the third governor after statehood, along with being a senator during the Illinois territory timeframe. A Facebook group was formed, removed the Ninian Edwards statue, and renamed Ninian Edwards Plaza, was formed quickly, and it grew to over 500 people overnight. This group petitioned the city to tear down the statue and rename the park. The statue in the park became the topic of many discussions at our community and service community, as well as city council. Groups from both keep the statue and remove the statue made presentations. In December of 2020, the Truth Racial Healing Transformation Center of Southern Illinois University Edwardsville hosted a virtual forum moderated by the League of Women Voters to enlighten the public in a non-confrontational manner on how the statute came to be and why it is a problem. This forum started out with an alderman speaking as to the history of the statue in the park. When he did his research, he discovered that a small triangular piece of land as you entered the downtown area of the city was basically an eyesore. A private group of donors was formed, money raised, and the land was purchased for a park. Trees were planted, a fountain was installed, and it was decided that the statue of the city's namesake would be a nice addition to the city's entrance. Some say that the statue of Ninian Edwards was erected by default. There were two other prominent men in the city's history that already had and received recognition. They were Edward Coles, who has a monument and a segregated cemetery, as well as Benjamin Stevens, who has a house named after him. Both were friends and colleagues of Ninian Edwards. Since these two men were recognized already, it seemed fitting to do something for Ninian Edwards. As one of the aldermen could tell, no background research was done on Edwards. The next speaker of this forum, which is very important, was a professor from SIUE who gave an explanation as to what a monument is and what purpose it serves. It turns out that because Ninian Edwards was short, he was elevated on the park's pedestal. This pedestal not only raised him off the ground so that you could see him better, but it also made it appear that it was a person to be held in high esteem. This was the point that the professor drove home. The pedestal adds to the problem of the statue. Are we keeping the monument in public places worth the pain it is causing? The question was asked. Additional speakers were able to point to the following. A monument will be recognizing and acknowledging systematic racism by allowing a statue of someone that represents these ideals. So you're asking yourself, what crimes against humanity did Ninian Edwards commit? Well, Edwards defied federal law to keep at least one male slave longer than allowed after the man was born into his possession. Edwards owned the man for at least 35 years, when at the time the law stated slaves could only be owned for up to 30 years. Edwards' pursuit of Indians' removal as governor or territorial governor, he twice sent Illinois militia against Native Americans in the War of 1812 and the Winnebago War, and signed treaties for the secession of Native Americans. Edwards also vetoed abolitionist legislation and the indigenous population that led to charge of massacre. Edwards worked to keep slavery as part of the Illinois Constitution. Those in favor of keeping the statue, one of our local, very respected historians thinks the statue should remain there, and she is quoted in a local newspaper saying, "It is my personal opinion. There are people who don't like the looks of the statue, and so they just making an excuse for it. We we can't assess history through the lens of modern sensibilities. Another viewpoint of the group is that not everyone is perfect. The statue with an interpretive plaque will point out Edwards' faults. And of course, this is the reason why many are opposed to the statue. The city's position? Well, to be honest with you, the city wish that this problem would just go away. This issue is very divisive, and you're not going to please anyone or majority of the population. In December, the city did rename the plaza to City Plaza, but it has not come to a conclusion in regards to what to do with the statue. In Susan Newman's book, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil, she says monuments are values made visible. Monuments are symbol of an ideology that refuses to allow feelings for others. So this is where I conclude my piece. Very divisive issue. It's still up in the balance what's going to be happening. My personal opinion is that the statue will ultimately be removed and placed in storage. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Again, that's interesting. And in your case, that statue hasn't been up that long. While Andrea is dealing with statues that have been up for hundreds of years, I think your statue was 2008.
That's correct. And at the time that the statue was erected, there was no regulations or ordinances governing the erection of a statue and recognition of a person in history. But now there is. I actually wrote that ordinance back in 2016.
So before this movement really took hold.
That's correct.
Okay, very good. All right, next we're going to go to the one that grabbed a lot of headlines, which would be the city of Chicago, and we're going to go to Sherry Williams for some of her input. Sherry?
Well, hello, everyone. Andrea, Walt, David, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I am Sherry Williams, speaking to you live from sunny Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. And I'd like to take this opportunity to just take a step back and look at a little bit about the history of before this summer and before George Floyd's murder and other things that really have started these wonderful, rich conversations. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, I wanted to point out, just as great brother Walt has, the long-standing inequities in governing bodies that promote and protect state historic sites, local sites, Chicago sites, for selection of locations and for creating marker programs and for installing markers and for installing monuments, the management and care of these monuments and tributes to what we presume are Illinois notables. Black communities have been spectators to decisions and power for a very long time when it's come to the installation and creation of monuments. And the disconnect has existed for decades. You know, while it's encouraging that these intentional and deliberate dialogues and symposiums and talks have been happening all over the country, many agencies and departments and state governments and federal governments need not look far for platforms and collaboration for solution building. Some can even look at emails inquiries that I've sent over many years addressing how I have looked at some of these state sites and the language that really needs to be revisited because they are, in my opinion, are revisionist histories. One of the things that I do know is that our communities are very much openly examining how white supremacy and racism has played a huge role in who gets recognized. So Black people have been marginalized and maybe none or one or two Black people may exist on boards or are part of decision-making bodies which install these monuments that are now challenged from the beginning. There absolutely many times are not Black presence when these decisions are made about installations. So presence on boards don't necessarily mean having an African American present equates to engagement or involvement or even action to support equity. But I really believe that we have been going backwards for a very long time when it comes to looking at just how and who this determines what gets placed in public spheres in terms of who's recognized or acknowledged by a tribute, a monument, or a marker. There has been exclusion on many levels of government, and today I'd like to use, speak in my own language on what I'm responding to through inquiries that have come to our office at Bronzeville Historical Society. And what I'm responding to is that monuments, tributes, statues are not in violation of my personal right or others' personal right to agree or disagree on their usefulness or their utility. Black people, speaking for myself, actually have expressed to me that they don't want to see the Douglas Tomb site in Chicago removed because it's been a centerpiece for engagement for many people. And so my opinion is that it should remain just because it's a burial site. So desecration of graves is far different from just removing a marker or a tribute that doesn't cover where currently someone is buried. So I didn't just learn that, for instance, that Stephen A. Douglas and George Washington, or even the Pullman State Site, which is now a national monument, are representation of white supremacy. These are things that we've known for a very long time. Long-standing racially polarized policies, rules, and mandates and laws are collectively associated with these publicly funded or managed historical sites. So, our communities have been looking at the fact that tax dollars have managed the care or have supported installations of historical figures for the state or for national platforms. But, so often when there's pushback about these historic sites, there's resistance too often. And I faced that as a result of my presence at Stephen A. Douglas Tomb site from 2012 to 2017. So I believe that I was deliberately and intentionally ignored for years when I spoke about engagement around these painful conversations, these painful histories should have been part of the narrative when it came to interpreting many sites. I also encouraged that the then present, and I'm talking about in 2009, the Illinois State Historic Sites had their own board for the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency. And they welcomed the idea of Black presence at sites. And so Bronzeville Historical Society moved into the Pullman State Historic Site in 2009. And we represented then the only Black presence in any state site. And so I think we have 56 state sites. And so to me, that showed that they understood that many narratives were marginalized and not present in state sites. Once we moved from the Stephen A. Douglas Tomb Site Cottage building in 2017, I haven't seen any evidence of narratives around African-American presence in Illinois. And I'm just going to speak to that. I know that there are other communities' narratives that are also marginalized, but so far as Black communities, I haven't seen any input into creating narratives that speak about Black presence at historic sites that are managed by the state of Illinois. And obviously, after hearing Walt talk a little bit about the demographics of Edwardsville, there is Black presence pretty much everywhere in the state of Illinois. And so it's appalling for me to even wrap my head around all of these, 55, 56 sites, not having something static, something representative of the Black voice of Illinois. Again, I want to just kind of go back and look at how Black communities, have always fully understood the painful history connected to monuments, to slavery, and to white supremacy. And we challenged in Chicago these narratives that excluded us from sites that were intimately connected to our communities by using the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site as a platform to talk about the duality of or even looking at how Stephen A. Douglas was, in my opinion, had a moral compass that was not shaped around what I thought someone as being an outstanding person to have a marker to. Certainly his role as a state legislator has its own merit, but if we were to look at and examine his personality and the things that he had done in his lifetime, I agree with Walt that, where was the reasoning behind making tributes to these individuals if someone had looked at criteria more closely. The same for Edwardsville. So from 2009 into 2017, every event that we hosted at the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site, we would read all 129 names of the men and women who were enslaved at Douglas's plantations in Mississippi. And I received access to the material through my attending many years the wreath laying that's hosted every year in honor of Stephen A. Douglas's birthday in June. And because I would attend those wreath ceremonies, I was able to meet the family, the extended family, the descendants of Stephen A. Douglas. And they shared with me, I want to say in 2009, that they had plans to commit all of Douglas's papers to the University of Chicago Regenstein Library. So unless you're a scholar who is associated with the University of Chicago, a teacher, alumni, or faculty, or student, of course, many institution libraries are not accessible to the public. So I began a campaign with asking the University of Chicago, could I access these materials along with others who were part of the Bronzeville Historical Society, and we were granted library cards to go in and take a look ourselves, physically look at the records, so that we would walk around with at least some information about the life of Douglas. And so among those papers was this handwritten list of the 129 slaves that Douglas owned. And so we've used that as a tool to talk about, who do we celebrate? How do we honor them? And the bigger question for me is, who makes these decisions, to install these monuments? Is it publicly funded or is it partially publicly funded? So finding out who to go to say, if I want to make a recommendation on the installation of a marker, say for Louis Armstrong, who lived in Chicago, or whomever I believe deserves some merit to be recognized and acknowledged as having some tremendously important input into society, I have no idea how to go about doing that. But somehow, for hundreds of years, I've been able to see that there has been funding that has either been appropriated or put aside to the management and care of these monuments that we're now looking at as having challenging histories. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, how problematic that is going forward, that there needs to be a clear criteria, there needs to be some understanding on how we could advance putting narratives or creating spaces that welcome peace, harmony, restorative justice, and all of those kind of things that certainly are part of conversations globally. And one of the things I have done is I created a petition asking that our governor re-examines the use and utility of Stephen A. Douglas tomb site and make it a restorative justice center. I sent the budget, which really is just putting a mobile home, a mobile unit, office unit on the grounds, and then have a way that the community can have a way to engage the site. And so that's some of the solutions that have been emerging out of conversations with those who live directly across the street from the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site. There are 5 high-rise buildings, each building 10 floors each. Each building has an excess of over 1,000 residents, and they've been using this site since 1971. So that's just, giving you some idea of the proximity that Douglas tomb site has had in the Bronzeville community. And so I just want to pause there with just giving you some of the history and background on the work of the society in the Bronzeville community.
Thank you, Sherry. And you bring up a lot of, I think, good issues or important issues. So I'd like to throw out a couple of questions to panelists, and I'll pick on you individually, so stay alert. But you bring up a great point, Sherry, about community involvement. Communities change, neighborhoods change. Statues at one point people thought were forever, and maybe they're not. But community involvement is so important. So Andrea, you work for the legislature, elected officials, so almost by definition, they have community involvement. But as someone who's also in Springfield like yourself, I think the issue came to a head in large measure here in terms of the capital statues because of local protests. And I'm curious, has a mechanism been put in place for the future of statues, and how much of that local protest or just what was going on in the nation as a whole influenced the legislature?
Sure. So I believe, Dave, you are right. It is that local protest really sparked the thought and the background behind, really evaluating, are we idolizing those in our history or our past? If someone is placed on the Capitol grounds, the People's House of Illinois, we want to make sure that they represent all of us. And so, that I believe that was the movement on why it was stated that Pierre Menard and Stephen Douglas needed to be removed. We have not come up with any, rules or guidelines or bylaws on how something like this will be addressed in the future. Now, I can speak to my agency kind of governs what happens on the complex, and we have statutes that indicate fairly strictly who can be on the complex in statue, portrait, mural form. So that's something that our next step actually is to start looking inside the building. So we have a lot of items that are all cataloged by what we call a historic structures report. And our next step is to engage in an outside firm to help us study some of the background of a lot of the individuals who are portrayed in one of those medias, whether it be a mural, a portrait, or a statue, to help us understand, we've addressed what's outside, and now let's focus inside. But besides that, there really hasn't been any other discussion on going forward, what do and what don't we allow.
But it's fair to say, again, it's being driven by the legislature, by elected officials from all over Illinois.
Correct.
Okay, and then Walter, you had talked a little bit about how in Edwardsville, it kind of started, you had a petition, an online petition that had 500 signatures within a day, or people. So Edwardsville, does it have a mechanism? Do you think people know one way or the other that they have a way to address these issues?
The residents are aware that they can come to City Council. They have 3 minutes at the beginning of any public meeting to voice their concern. that has been well utilized. I concur with things have been already said, but just let me remind you how divisive this issue is. When you attend one of our council meetings or committee meetings, if it's not unanimous consent, there's maybe one person or alderman in dissent of an issue. This is one of the few times that our aldermen have been divided over an issue. So it is an issue that its passion runs high on both sides, and there's no clear path to understanding without making a sizable portion of the population upset. So yes, the population, the residents are aware how they can get their voice in the room. Our organization, the NAACP, encourages to get our members to get their voices in the room and have it heard. And but again, this is a issue that there's no clear-cut path to understanding or compromise.
And then Sherry, I don't want to especially pick on you, but can you tell me a little bit about, again, we're talking, I guess, a mechanism, the Chicago Monuments Association. I don't believe you're on that commission, but that seems like that's the city of Chicago's mechanism, at least for now, in terms of reviewing these kind of issues. I mean, when I gave my opening remarks, I was quoting directly from their website.
You know, one of the challenges about the Monuments Commission in Chicago is that it emerged out of just, I guess, following the removal of the Columbus statutes that was done kind of like in the still of the night, following what the mayor perceived as a real danger. If it would topple, there could be injuries or further. One of the things that I do know is that when I reached out to the Monuments Commission, my inquiry was about the makeup of the commission, and actually wanting to inquire as to, you know, who made the selection. And I was told that the commission was solidly completed and that there were no spaces available for additional people to be a part of the commission. And when I looked at the members of the commission, I was alarmed to see that there were 4 African Americans on the commission, but none lived in the communities where these monuments that are considered challenging monuments, or monuments that have narratives that are being explored for removal. The list now is at 40, which are identified as having a problematic narrative. But again, looking at the commission itself, I didn't see any representation of those who have been using or having events or making events available to the public at these sites that have been a problem site according to this list. So imagine that, you know, the longest standing African-American parade in the city of Chicago, the Bud Billiken Parade, its conclusion has been at George Washington Park since way before I was born. They have a 97-year history, don't quote me on it, but it's well over 70 years. And so I know that spaces that might have a name associated with someone who owned slaves or had a character or had a history that is now seen as one that should be re-examined. These spaces we've been using in ways beyond its intent. So if George Washington Park in Chicago was meant to honor and recognize him as the first president, our communities have known that history. We have looked at these spaces as being adjacent to our homes and a place in which we still can come together in a public setting, in a public park. And so I was alarmed by seeing that those on the commission did not represent the folks who actually use these spaces. And neither was there an appeal to build this commission body. We just looked up and there was the commission. So it started out, in my opinion, already plagued with some issues about equity. and inclusion. And I think that going forward for any government, any organization to even look at, or any agency to look at, how do you really involve those who it would impact, there's some work that's got to be done. And there's no one solution for every community. There's not one solution for the removal or retaining a monument. You may find some communities, just as I said about the Douglas Tomb site, that have always seen this monument to Douglas as not being a representation of their desire or to salute him, but they see it as part of this painful history that we've had to deal with on a daily basis. And so these are things that I think have to be considered when we're talking about solution building.
Well, you raised some good points, and I think, actually, I think Walter kind of also mentioned I know this has been, it's been an issue for a long time. Nobody's unaware of a lot of this stuff, but it really crystallized again in 2020, and I think people are still trying to figure out a lot of their ways, how we're going to address it. I know the commission, or the Monuments Commission in Chicago, is having hearings all over the place, but it still seems like it's relatively new, which in a lot of ways is unfortunate. On a more positive note than tearing down statues and deciding that, we had a forum, actually, Andrea, here in Springfield, talking about the statues on the lawn. It was sponsored by one of the local newspapers, and one of the panelists made a great point, to my thought, is it shouldn't just be about tearing down. It's like, what about adding? What's missing? Who's not there? Or what about even adding plaques to discuss some of these issues a little bit more? Stephen Douglas at the tomb site, for example. So what about adding? Andrea, are there any plans for the complex?
There are not at this point. So Martin Luther King is displayed on the corner of Capitol and 2nd. And he sits what I would call on the State Library lawn, kind of looking towards the Capitol building. There was a mention of someone within the legislative body that suggested Martin Luther King actually be moved to the Capitol complex. So sit on the Capitol lawn. That wasn't mentioned. It hasn't grown any legs lately. That could be something in the future. To give you a little bit of a background, my agency is in the process of completing a master plan. And with some renovation work happening at the Capitol, we are a little bit gun shy on placing anything because they may not be there long. We would have to relocate them and then place them back just because of the activity that's going to be going on here. I do foresee on the Capitol complex someday we have a statue garden or a statue plaza. And when that happens, I see maybe that discussion being brought up is who is here, why are they here, and how can we teach people? You know, that is something that's on my list. I hope that before I retire, we get a chance to address it. But in the future, we could see a lot more statues grace us with their presence here, or we could find out that digging deeper, there are more that need to go.
Walter, what about in Edwardsville?
Same goes for what has already been said, so I'm going to repeat that. It's very difficult.
What about, again, we talked about history being nuanced. Has there been discussions about like a plaque by the Edwards statue?
Yes, it was. It was an interpretive plaque, and again, that was seen as unacceptable.
Oh, okay.
Because it allows the city to move away, push away from the narrative, but the group that is opposed to, who wants the removal of the statue, views that as totally unacceptable.
Okay, and then Sherry, what about additional Additional monuments, statues, park names?
Well, there's a number of figures in Chicago whom have not received recognition, and this, I'm quoting what communities are saying, that certainly have been galvanized around, this is the time to get a monument for Ida B. Wells. This is the time to get a monument statue dedicated to Sabo. So those are two figures way before the current conversations that we're having now that have been on the table for many years. You know, imagine that DuSable High School, I think, was completed in the early 50s. And so there had always been in African-American communities an understanding about the role of DuSable in the founding of Chicago as a city. And those are the two that would say that are in front of whom people believe should have a monument dedicated to them. In terms of looking at present sites, others as myself believe that creating new narratives could be a solution. I really am opposed to spending money on the removal of, you know, now the Chicago list is at 40. I really believe that amenities that have been neglected, resources that have not been a part of Chicago Park District or a community surrounding the Park District is a big question for me. It doesn't negate the fact that these figures, of course, have painful histories, but you know, since 2009, the restrooms at the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site have been broken. You know, there had been letters and letters and letters sent by organizations like the Chicago Cultural Alliance, Bronzeville Historical Society, and many others wanting to address the crumbling infrastructure of state sites. And I really believe that these places that maybe don't have a painful history could best benefit from any funding sources that would come in terms of preserving history. But, you know, who am I to say, instead of spending money to remove a marker, you know, why don't we have operating restrooms at the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site, which had been used and I don't know its current status or demographics or the number of people that visit there now. But when I was using the cottage building as our office, thousands of people came to that site, and all for different reasons. You know, not necessarily to give a nod to Douglas or to recognize his role as a legislator, but many people were coming there because it was a place of reflection for them. Parks in Chicago, as the improvements occurred over the past 10 years or more, I'd say probably 15 years up into current time, our parks now have parking meters. We don't have access to our resources, our lakefront, our park amenities. In a community that largely has Black children who are under the poverty level. I mean, this is information available when you visit any school's demographics. It will tell you 75 to 99% of these students, their parents are receiving some kind of support, whether it's food stamps or something. So imagine, you know, I call it park apartheid. When I look at the access to spaces that are publicly funded, I think I would rather address fueling a way for us to be able to fully use some of these spaces in a better way, as opposed to spending money to tear down things that have been in our neighborhood for 100 years or more. That's just my opinion. You know, fix the bathroom so we can use sites.
All right, well, thank you for that. I know Walter and Andrea can't relate to budget issues in their jobs, right? It's never a consideration, but that's an interesting point you take. or you make. And it also, you know, brings up that what is government's role? Most monuments like this are government oriented. Walter talked about it was a private foundation though that put up the Edwards statue. Andrea, the Menard statue was the first statue on the Capitol complex, and that was a gift from a relative of his old trading partner, which brings in interesting dynamics as well. But with that, I'm going to conclude the taped version or the taped portion of this. I think we've hit most of the issues I want to talk about. Adding monuments. Is there a mechanism for public involvement? And just again, the history of what's going on in your community. So we'll end the taped portion of this, and then we'll reconvene on April 24th after this is shown to you know, to take some questions from the audience. I'm sure there'll be many questions, but I want to thank my panelists. I think this is great. I love how Chicago, Springfield, and Edwardsville, that's a nice mix. And if you throw in Newton, Illinois, we've really covered the state pretty darn well here. So I appreciate that.